G'day. Welcome to the AgriCoach podcast for families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the financial bloke. Welcome back to the AgriCoach Wealth and Wisdom podcast. My name's Ben Law, and I'm the financial bloke. And today we're talking about something I believe every high-performing family should prioritise early. Don't just hand down family wealth. Teach your kids to build it themselves. One thing I've noticed over and over again when working with families, the ones who have their act together, is that they encourage their kids to start building their own wealth early. Whether it's with shares, saving for a deposit on a house, or buying their first investment property, they understand that learning how to grow and manage wealth is a skill, and the earlier you start, the better. And while there are a lot of ways to build wealth, one of the most common goals I hear from young people and their parents is, I want to get into my first investment property or my first home. Now, before we dive into property and borrowing, I want to make something really clear. Buying an investment property isn't the only way you can build wealth. Often for young people, starting with shares or managed funds can make a lot more sense. Why? Well, you don't need to borrow. You can start really small and even with, a few $100 to $1,000. And most importantly, it helps develop the habit of investing early without taking on really big risk or complexity. That's what I'm doing with my daughter right now. She's got a managed fund share portfolio, and when she's older, that's likely to form the foundation for a deposit on her first house or investment property. Now, that's not to say property's a bad move. It's just my daughter's only 9 and a long way from having a job and being able to borrow and buy an investment property. But when she does, we'll need to look at borrowing. And to do that, we need a bank. And one way to find the best bank for you is to use a broker. And that brings me to today's guest, Ryan Baddock of RB Finance. Ryan's going to walk us through exactly how young people can set themselves up properly if property is the path they want to take. But before we jump in, let's keep the lawyers happy with a disclaimer. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for educational purposes only. It's not financial advice and it's not legal advice. Please don't act on anything without getting specific advice for your personal circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor, but I choose to be no longer licensed, and I cannot and will not give personal financial advice on this podcast. All right, now that the lawyers are happy, let's get into it. Welcome, Ryan.
G'day, Ben. How you going? Thanks for having me.
Mate, great to have you here. Now, Ryan, you and I have known each other for, I think I worked out this morning, probably over 20 years now. But for those that don't know you, mate, what's your backstory?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So born down in South Australia and sort of grew up in the city with parents in normal sort of city area, but then moved to a horticultural property in Mildura in my early teens. And yeah, kind of, I suppose I always grew up on the farm down there. Yeah, just went to ag college after school and then ended up sort of bouncing around a couple of jobs and fell into banking in the early 2000s and worked with a couple of big banks around Victoria, New South Wales, and then finally settled up in Toowoomba in Queensland and stayed in the banking game up until 2017 and then started up RB Finance at the beginning of 2017 and have been running our family business here in Toowoomba since then, mate. So, yeah. That's the short backstory.
Awesome, mate. And so you're like myself, you've got your wife working in the business as well. So like me, your wife is home boss and work boss. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, as long as that's how it appears, that's everyone's happy that way, Ben. So yeah, Meg's met Meg working in the bank actually down in Albury, and yeah, she's got a country background as well. So it's been good to have her come into the business, and yeah, she sort of does all the things that I don't want to do, I suppose, and a lot of the the little things in the background that need to get done. And yeah, she's a great help to us. And as you said, she's the boss here when she needs to be, that's for sure.
So, mate, you're a broker, essentially. I mean, your banking background for many, many years. But just to start this off, what the hell is a broker, mate?
Yeah, so I think a broker's like a matchmaker for your finance, I suppose. So we work with dozens of lenders, not just, I think our panel's about 60 lenders at the moment. So, we're, I suppose what we look is try and find the lender that'll suit the client rather than have the client fit the lender. And then yeah, we just basically coach people through the process and make sure that they feel confident and comfortable with what they're doing, getting a clear picture on what their goals are, knowing what's possible, and then having us in their corner to help them, get things done, make sure things happen, and just ensure they get the best possible outcome when they're negotiating with their banks.
And what was it? We were old enough to remember the old, I think it was Aussie Home Loan slogan, keeping the banks honest. Was that right?
Yeah, keep them honest. And they had a great ad too where Aussie John used to walk through the crowd and he'd be yelling out different things that banks, can your bank do this? And they'd put their hand up and then he'd say, really? Can you do that? And, oh, no, not really. No. So, yeah, it's keeping them honest, but it's also, banks fundamentally at their core are all very similar, but they all have very different niches and different things that they do better than others. So it's just about making sure you find the right bank for the right circumstance and for the right, for that transaction or for your family or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, Aussie John and Aussie Home Loans, they kind of kicked off what is the broking industry, and it just continues to grow and grow from those early days for sure.
Yeah, well, I remember when I first got out of university, my massive stint in banking of a whole 13 months, there was no such thing really as a broker back then. And nowadays, there's a lot of brokers out there. What do you attribute the growth in that market to, Ryan?
I think there's two things. If you look at, there's a lot more stats around it in the residential space, but so it's kind of 75% of loans are written by brokers. And that just basically is bringing competition to the marketplace for smaller lenders. It's improving the pricing outcomes for borrowers. Since the mortgage industry's really kicked off, net interest margins for banks is kind of halved. And so bringing about more competition. And I think you see brokers, most of the people that you deal with and a lot of your listeners will be, in business themselves, and brokers are fellow business owners. So you get that kind of people understand that depth of understanding. We're in business every day. It's not just a 9 to 5, and you're not just dealing with, someone processing something in a dark room. You're dealing with a real person, and that can be a weekend call, an after hours call. Obviously with the farmers, it's, it can be before work or after work when they're back in the office. Rainy days are always busy when it's dealing with the farmers and they're all in the office or in the shed thinking up ideas. But I think it's an improved service, and it offers a broader choice for people. And I think that's where more and more people are seeing value in that, as well as getting those competitive outcomes.
No, I agree, mate. So where I want to head with this, mate, is I want to sort of zoom out to the big picture, sort of up to 40,000 feet. And we're talking about the next generation starting to build wealth and learn how to manage wealth themselves, not just get money handed down or wealth from mum and dad necessarily. So why do you think, because you come from an ag background, mate, and you deal with a lot of farmers, so why do you think it's so important for the next generation to start building their own wealth early, especially in the ag space?
I think typically, as you know, and as the listeners know, when you're looking at transition of ag assets, there's normally a lot of capital tied up in those things, and it's a big transaction to take care of. And I suppose by people starting to build wealth early and starting to understand the process, there's a couple of different things, I suppose. They build wealth early, and the earlier you get into the property market, the greater the impact that's going to have over time, as that asset continues to grow and as the compounding effect of that. So getting in early and building your own wealth that can then support your transition into the family business, if that's the way you go, or building your wealth outside of the family business so that you've got options down the track in the event that isn't where you end up going, or there is some changes to your trajectory down the track. I suppose that helps. And then secondly, getting into the property market and into the borrowing space early just helps you understand the mechanics of how it works, how to interact with the banks, what they're looking for. I suppose, where are the challenges and pitfalls? What do you need to do? And just really kind of learn and evolve and understand how to negotiate. A lot of people, when they first approach banks, they come sort of cap in hand and think that all the power's with the bank. But ultimately, as you continue to understand that marketplace, you start to gain more confidence in yourself and where you sit, and understand that you can have a bit more balance of power in that negotiation with the bank. And if you're getting into that early and you're getting exposed to that early in your life, then you're only going to get better at it when it really starts counting down the track.
Yeah, it's like the old rich dad, poor dad back in the day. I remember when that first came out, I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s, that was the real big thing, is people wanted to learn how to manage money and create wealth. And so many people just had never been taught, because they didn't have, in his terminology, the rich dad to teach them. And I think nowadays people are becoming more and more savvy and saying, well, we need our kids to learn how to manage money. I mean, my daughter's 9 and she's started to get a real good grasp on how to manage money. And I think the sooner we can do that, the better off they'll be. Because if they're not coming on farm, they're going to have to learn how to build their own wealth. And maybe there's some estate equalisation, 1 or 2 siblings get some of the farms, and then off-farm siblings get some assets. They need to know how to manage those assets. And the last thing you want to do is leave it until they're 40, 50, and then inherit and not know how to manage the money. And it's going to become a net negative to them in life.
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge. It's like when you if you don't have a great deal of debt in your life, then you have a lot of choices, and you flexibility around your cash flow is a lot freer and those sorts of things. And you've got to learn to live with a bit of debt sometimes. And I don't say everyone should go and get debt. I just mean that if you need debt and if that's something that comes into your life, it takes a bit of a skill and a bit of an ability and knowledge to learn how to live with it and manage your business and manage your cash flow around the fixed nature of debt repayments and debt obligations. And I suppose it's not something you just wake up and you're good at. So like everything, you've got to learn to understand it and learn to appreciate it. And I think too, learning to manage that aspect of your business with farmers put a lot of effort into managing the crops or managing the cattle side of it or managing pastures and right down to the nth degree of this much nitrogen and this much whatever. But sometimes just park the debt in the corner and don't really pay enough attention to it. And so I think it's a real evolution for people to go through. And like you said, getting into it early is something that just helps that knowledge grow.
It does. And also too, you think if you've got one of your children coming back to take over the farm and the debts, it's not unreasonable for families to have, multiple millions of dollars worth of debt, maybe up to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of debt. And it's much easier for them to manage a $300,000 or $400,000 home loan or an investment property loan than take on and start to cut their teeth and make mistakes on $10 million or $30 million. I think it's a great breeding ground for how to manage that. So now, Ryan, if we want to get really practical, because I want us to go away with some real practical stuff. Let's assume you've got a young person. They're saying, hey, mum and dad's suggesting, or we've decided we want to do it. We want to borrow some money. We'd love to go buy an investment property. What's the key things that they need to know up front about actually going about getting? One thing I've noticed after working with successful families over the last 20 years, they find a way to surround themselves with other driven, switched-on families. They don't leave it to chance, especially when it comes to their kids, because deep down they know this: you become who you mix with, and so do your children. That's why I created the High Performing Families Accelerator, a private mastermind group for families who are still growing strongly, but know succession is coming in 5 to 10 years, and want to make sure they're prepared for a smooth and successful transition. It's handpicked by me, only the kind of families I want my family to be around. Driven, motivated, committed to strong relationships, but ultimately building big futures and doing the work to get there. I've limited it to 15 families to keep it tight-knit, and right now there are only 3 seats left. So if you're serious about the future and want your family in the right room, go to agricoach.com.au/prepare to learn more. Now, let's get back to the episode. Alone.
Yeah, interesting. I think that often the parents will suggest that, kids, let's go and buy an investment in town or in any location, I suppose. And what we see with farming families often is that there's some unique things that they need to be prepared for when they present their case to the bank to obtain the money. Typically, if you're working for family, you need to be able to show some extra information around how you're generating your income. And so making sure that you are actually being paid, I suppose, and then being able to demonstrate that. If you're just if you're working as a teacher or a nurse or something like that and you've got 2 pay slips and the bank will accept that. Whereas if you're working for mum and dad, you're going to need to show a little bit more supporting information that goes around a couple of pay slips. We can't just manufacture a couple of pay slips for the kids. So we need to basically look at the consistent income. We want to look at the deposits. So most of the time, if you're looking at an investment property, you really want to consider around a 10% kind of deposit for an investment property just to cover off on all the things. If you're going to buy a house for yourself to live in, there are some schemes that allow you to get away with a much less sort of 5%-ish deposit plus a few costs. And I suppose just understanding where your existing obligations are and if you've got a credit card or a car loan or some other things, just making sure that that's all neat and tidy and squared away. Often young people have got a bit of afterpay or that sort of buy now, pay later things, and we just really want to make sure that they're under control and in a manageable position. They're not an outright knockout for you if you've got those types of things, but you do need to be able to demonstrate that you can kind of manage the money that you've currently got before a lender will just load you up with a little bit more debt. So they're the key things, I suppose, but you just want to have that, the income and deposit are the most critical things to understand, and getting yourself in a position to go and talk to a broker or your bank, your family's banker, and just have a chat and say, this is what I'm planning on doing. How can you help me? What's the strategy? And hopefully you get an outcome that you like. If not, find someone that can help you.
Yeah. So I just want to pick a few things you said in there, Ryan. So one of the things I see in a lot of farming operations is casual work. So in other words, I work for mum and dad contracting, and then I work for the neighbour down the road, and it's sort of casual and not locked in. Or we're just on drawings. We don't actually pay a wage to the next generation. We just give them a drawing each week, and then the accountant works that out in the background. Is that a problem for them?
Basically, what the banks want to see when you're working is consistent and regular kind of income. So if you're working in a contracting basis, then you're going to need to demonstrate your income through a couple of tax returns potentially. So that can take a little bit longer to get to that point.
So over a couple of years is what you're saying?
Yeah, potentially. Or if you're working as, getting paid, whether it be casual or whether it's, it's a fortnightly salary or whatever, the bank's going to want to see that you've had that coming into your bank account anywhere between 3 and 6 months, depending on the lender. So they'll want to support those pay slips that you've got with salary credits into your bank account. So they want to see those two things. You might be able to support that with your income statement from the tax office that shows what income's been actually paid to you. So it isn't an outright knockout that you're working some down the road and some for your parents and doing a little bit of contracting. But the further away you stray from regular, stable, fortnightly income and more into a bit of contracting and a bit of other outside work, then the more documentation you're going to have to present to actually show to the lender that you are generating that consistent, regular income. Yeah, but there's no drama with casual income as long as you've been doing it for a decent period of time. And every lender has different policies, but typically 6 months is something you need to look at. So where possible, if you can demonstrate that you're getting paid that fortnightly wage and showing it hit your bank account, then we just treat you like anyone else, except with just a couple of extra documents to go along with it.
But the point is that you can't just all of a sudden wander into the bank and say, hey, I've got my deposit. You've got to dot your I's and cross your T's, and it's better to know that in advance so you can get your ducks in a row, because if you do require, in some cases, 2 years to prove your self-employed income, then you want to be prepared for that and not save your deposit, get everything in a row, then go to the bank and them saying, sorry, you don't have 2 years worth of tax returns. We're not going to lend you the money. I mean, you're better off to know up front. Wouldn't that be fair?
Yeah, 100%. And also know that each bank has a different policy. So you can, if you're talking to a broker, we will be able to sit down and show you what policies align with your current circumstance or what the strategy needs to be. I mean, we're just currently in the process of doing a loan for one of our clients' children in this exact example, and they've been just setting themselves up so they're getting those salary credits for 3 months. They've got the pay slips for 3 months. And once we get that 3 months credits, we're ready to go. We've got the contract in place and we're going to lodge the application. Early on in that piece, the borrower had the deposit, but we didn't have the regular stable income that you mentioned at the start. And they were looking at drawings and things like that, was just not acceptable to the bank. So, yeah, having that strategy just saved a lot of heartache, I suppose, and a lot of mucking around. And it also meant that they didn't wait 6 months because they knew that they could get away with it in 3 months or get it done in 3 months. But sometimes you might go, I've got to wait 6 months or I've got to wait 2 years because, that's what happened to Johnny down the road. But your circumstance might be slightly different. And so you haven't necessarily lost any time if you've been able to get in a bit earlier if that worked for you. So, yeah.
I can imagine that would be a bit of a problem for people. And also too and I've seen this happen in the past too, Ryan, is where they've gone to their bank manager. So they've gone to mum and dad's agri-bank manager and said, this is what we want to do. And the bank manager's either looked at it or they've sent it to their team and it hasn't ticked all the boxes. And so they've gone, oh, no, you can't borrow the money at the moment. Go off and save a deposit. Then all of a sudden, 3 months later, they go see a broker and the broker says, well, yeah, that's true with the bank your family's working with, but, the other one just around the corner, they'll actually do it with X, Y, Z. And they go, oh, gee, I wish I'd known that. And I think that's a common mistake people seem to make is they just check with the one bank what the requirements are. And those requirements can change frequently, can't they? Like you could go see your bank and they say, no, we can't do it. And then 3 months later they could, or 3 days later, and vice versa. They'll say, yep, we'll do it if you've got this. But then 3 months later you go back to them and say, well, I've got that. And they say, oh, we've changed our lending criteria.
Yeah, that happens from time to time. And, from working as a agri manager in a couple of banks, doing a home loan when you're an agri manager is not a fun thing. So most people don't want to do it. So, yeah, it's just you don't necessarily get the outcome from the family banker. You'll definitely get some support and some guidance, don't get me wrong, but it's not always going to be the perfect answer for you. So the rules and the policies, the guidelines are always changing. That's one of the hardest things about our job is understanding what 40 different banks do and then how they all change and trying to fit people into the right box. But yeah, it's just worthwhile making sure you've got, like you said, got your ducks lined up and you know what the options are.
Okay, cool. And so from a deposit point of view, you said roughly 10, let's just assume 10% for the purposes of the discussion. And just by the way, that's not advice to everyone listening out there. That's just, we're using this for illustrative purposes only. But we've got this 10% and we walk into the bank and say, yep. And that can be a fair chunk of money for people. You know, if you buy an investment property worth 500 grand, which for 500 grand, you're not getting a McMansion these days, are you? So that means you've got to have 50 grand sitting in the bank. Is the bank then going to take your word on whether you can pay that off, or are they actually going to look at your situation and work out whether you actually can pay that loan off?
Yeah, they'll definitely look at your situation and work out whether you can. They'll look at obviously they'll look at what your income's at. If you're buying an investment property, they'll look at what the potential future rent is. So you get a rental appraisal and they'll stack up your wage versus your rental income that's coming in. They'll look at the obviously expenses of owning the property and the expenses of, you know, your lifestyle. And then they'll make a determination on what your borrowing capacity looks like. So, you know, the two things that limit how much you can borrow, one is basically the deposit, and the second one is your income relative to your expenses. So they'll consider both those things. Another thing that's always good for lenders when you're first starting out is to potentially demonstrate that you have what's referred to as a propensity to repay. So in the event that you're going to apply for a loan, and let's just say it's $1,000 a month repayments, if you've actually been saving $1,000 a month or some equivalent thereof, a combination of rent and savings, then you're already living as if you've got the loan. That can sometimes help a lender where you can really demonstrate that you have been living that lifestyle. You know, if you trip over and find 50 grand in your pocket and then front up to the bank and that's all you've got, you know, everything's maxed out and there's never any cash in your bank account, then you're not really demonstrating a kind of sensible position to the credit manager who's approving your loan. And ultimately, there's still people that approve your loans and they still do look at those little things. You got to tick the boxes and get the green lights along the way, but then ultimately there is a human at the other end that's going to look at it and see if it all makes sense. So you want to show a responsible picture, I suppose.
I remember, Ryan, this would be a number of years ago now, but I remember I was talking to someone about getting a home loan, one of their first ones, and the bank was really checking where they were spending their money, down to the extent where they were working out how much they were spending on takeaway off their bank statements. You know, they had KFC Dolby or something like that, I remember they said, and showed that they'd had KFC every week on the way back from doing a swing shift. And they said, well, if we get this home loan, we're not going to be doing takeaway. Do the banks still at this level literally go through where you are spending money to make sure you're not bullshitting them?
Some do and some don't. Some go through with a bit more forensically than others. Yeah, so yes and no. It would depend. But I think if you're looking at, it's not as strict as it once was, and there's a couple of banks that were getting, you know, fairly well raked over the coals with their way they assess living expenses. But certainly if you're around about the benchmark and then everything's making sense, then, you know, there is some leniency. And clearly people do have the ability to rein in their discretionary spending when they do get a mortgage. And that's typically what Australians do, is they pay the mortgage first and then everything else comes after that. So, you know, there is some flexibility, but it's things that can be a problem is excessive gambling or any kind of untoward, you know, potentially criminal type activities and that sort of stuff in your bank statements will be a problem. And gambling, it can be a big one. But I've also had examples where clients had, you know, a couple $100 a week at the TAB, and I asked them about it and they said, that's what we do for fun. I'm sure if that's your recreation, you have a bit of a punt on Saturday, then happy days. But, you know, we've also seen where people are hitting the ATM at the pub, you know, 7 times a night. That clearly can potentially look at, you know, might be an issue with pokies or whatever like that. So that can be a bit of a red flag for the lenders for sure.
So if we flip this over, because obviously if you've got a young person, saving up 50 grand or 100 grand for a deposit is a tougher gig these days than it's probably ever been. Now, what happens, we see a lot of families where mum and dad says, right, well, we want to help the kids out, get them on the ladder. And so that's what I'm doing with Sophie now. I'm investing, you know, I've set up an investment portfolio. I'm putting $100 a month into it. It's growing. She's learning how to manage it, and then that'll help towards then. But what a lot of parents get to is their kids get to the age and they say, we'd like to help them out. So how can, other than the obvious one, which is, like you said, 50 grand just landed in your bank account, which, you know, there's problems within itself strategically, but what's the way parents can actually start and help out kids when they can't quite get the lending across the line themselves?
For sure. I think so. As you mentioned, often parents will look at giving like a gift of funds so that they can support and help provide that deposit to the children, and that needs to be treated as a gift as such from the lender rather than another loan. And it's a common thing. The other one is you can look at a guarantee from your parents. And so the event that, unfortunately, you can't guarantee a home loan with a rural property, but if your parents have got an investment property in town or a property that is of residential nature, you can use that to provide a guarantee to support the borrowings of the children. And in effect, basically what happens is the children borrow 80% of the purchase price against the property that they're buying, and then they borrow 20%, which is secured by the parents' property. So that's probably the main thing, short of obviously helping the children build a little bit of wealth along the way, like you mentioned with Sophie, or, we've obviously got some clients that have got a few cows running around and they're building up a little bit of a business and a little bit of cash along the way. But if you're trying to do something in the short term, it really is a gift of funds, or it will be that family guarantee. But it just is important to note that you can't secure a home loan with 1,000 acres or 10,000 acres of rural property. So it does need to be considered separately. Yeah, they're probably the two easiest things to explain in the context of this setting, Ben. Yeah.
Well, I think also too, Ryan, just to state the absolute obvious, it's actually suggesting to the kids that this is a really good thing that they need to be doing, and infusing them with this ideology that they need to go build their own wealth if they're serious before they come looking to mum and dad necessarily for the next generation hand on. Now, I know that flies in the face of what I'm saying there to be able to say give your kids a deposit or help them out with a deposit, but sometimes that might in some cases be the thing that gets them across the line, but you've got to start back and make them understand the why and actually motivate or create the desire in them to actually want to do this themselves. And then you be the facilitator, as in to help move them in the right direction and reduce barriers. So the knowledge barrier, the saving barrier, the deposit barrier, the dealing with the bank, and maybe go along with your children to have a conversation with a bank or a broker to be able to help explain those things and getting them to start to learn the knowledge before they take action.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like everything. If you're prepared for those conversations, and if you're listening to this and you're wanting to go and talk to a bank or a broker, it's probably a good chance to have a chat to your parents and just see what hints and tips they might have and how they've dealt with it in the past, so that they can, you can go and know what you're walking into. And if you're prepared, then you're going to probably have a better outcome than just going in cold and you front up to a bank or a broker and say, hey, I want to buy a house. And they're like, well, where are you at so far? And you're kind of like, nowhere. It's always handy to have a bit of an idea of what you're looking for and get a little bit prepared.
And do you ever see, Ryan, from your experience, where siblings want to buy a place together? So in other words, I've saved 10 grand, you saved 10 grand, you say 10 grand, we all put it together, and then we can't afford a house on our own, but we could do it together. Do you ever see that happen, come across your desk?
Yeah. So I'm not going to say every day because it doesn't happen every day, but it does happen regularly enough where you've got 2 or 3 children that come together and will buy an investment property together, or they might all decide, if they're all living around the same location, they might all decide to buy a house and live in it together, that sort of thing. So, yeah, all the time you can absolutely do that. You can also, we see parents and children buying houses together. That can present complications down the track that's another asset that you've got to transition the ownership of in future. But that is an option as well where, parents and children do take joint ownership and do borrow jointly for a property, which ultimately may become, passed on to the child, but it's also another way to help get in. So you can do any combination. We've got 2 friends that come together and buy properties, and there's ways of quarantining the debt from one another and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, can be done. And if it's an investment property, you've got all sorts of various structures that the accountants are more across than what I'll talk about, but there's lots of different ways to protect everyone's interest in that property if it's not a single person or a spousal relationship, obviously. So
I think that's a really important point, Ryan, is, again, before you start off this process, is you want to go see a banker or a broker to say, well, what the bloody hell do I need to do to get borrowing ready? And I think you'd probably want to do that before you even look at investment properties, because you want to know your borrowing capacity first. Because if you're looking at $1 million houses and then you find out you can afford 200 grand, that's going to put a stick in the spoke, so to speak. But I think also too, it's really important to go and have the conversations with, and quite often it's best to start with the families people, is go and have a chat to your accountant or your mum and dad's accountant and just say, well, how should we buy this property for asset protection purposes and for tax purposes? And should it be be in your own individual names for tax purposes. You've got to think about first homeowners grants and things like that. But what name should it be in? Should it be in a company? Should it be in a trust? Whose name? What sort of borrowing should we have? Can we afford it? And also the legal side around, well, what happens if we get into a relationship, especially with young people? You know, you go buy an investment property, you start building up equity, and then you get into a relationship, a de facto relationship, and that separates. Well, is that exposed to any family law or issues that you could lose that? Could be around death. You know, someone dies. What happens with those assets and that debt? And all of a sudden that falls back on mum and dad. Mum and dad also need to know, well, what the bloody hell happens if our son or daughter goes rogue and just decides not to pay the loan? And we've got to have those conversations and do that research early. And I think that all needs to be done well and truly before you go start looking at properties. Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. I would like, it's nothing more disheartening than someone comes to us and says, hey, I've found a property, it's 800,000. And we go through the process and there's, your borrowing capacity is 400. That's a pretty disheartening conversation for everyone. So understanding where that looks like. And then just like any other transaction that you're entering into, any other kind of relationship, you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and we all know what to expect. You want to, as the saying goes, begin with the end in mind. So you want to know why you're doing it, what you're trying to achieve, and then understand what roles everyone's going to play. And it's no different to the family farm or no different to the family business. Everyone needs to know what role they're going to play in what you're doing. It may just be a house in town or a house in another town, but it's still an important, asset that you're going to hold and potentially worth, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in the future. So it's important to get off on the right foot. And just to pick up on something there too, often what people do is they live in Dalby, for example, or their farm's near Dalby, so they go and buy an investment property in Dalby. That may or may not be the best place for you to buy an investment property, so it's important to do your research around what do you want to get out of this investment property. Are you looking for the capital growth? You're looking for some yield? Is it convenience? That sort of thing, and then understand what market you should be shopping in as well. So, that comes from some professional advice from real estate agents or from, buyers agents and those sorts of things to help you find the right property in that right location.
Yep. Couldn't agree more, Ryan. So, mate, in your mind, if I had to put you on the spot, what's the number one mistake that someone that's going to buy their first investment property or their first home loan makes in your mind? That you see come into your office and you see it over and over again.
I think being underprepared and just not necessarily having an understanding of how the process works. And so they may go into the transaction and they try to enter into that transaction too early in the process, as we mentioned with before, when you're setting up that strategy. So that's a common mistake. They'll come without a deposit. So that some people think they've got a great income and no deposit, so they should be right. Or some people think they've got a great deposit, but their income doesn't support the level of debt that their deposit does. And that can be a common problem. Another one can be if you've gone through and got a number of credit cards or the buy now, pay laters and those sorts of things, and then you just get a bit lazy with the repayments, you're a bit late here and a bit late there. Those types of things really can hinder people's options when it comes to borrowing.
So that really does have an effect, mate.
Yeah, I mean, if you're showing one lender that you're not keeping up with your repayments, it's unlikely that another lender's going to lend you more money. Yeah, so that's the way to think about it. And I sometimes use the analogy that you're trying to borrow money off of a grumpy old man or woman that's sitting in the dark corner of a bank in Melbourne that doesn't like things very much. And if they start stacking up reasons for them not to give you the money, it's very hard to come back from there. And the banks can clearly see that. Even if you've had a credit card, you missed a payment for a couple of months, you went to Europe for a while and just forgot to pay the credit card while you're away, that'll stay on your credit file for a couple of years. And so that pops up, and it's not always the be-all and end-all, but it can be another thing that just tips you over into the negative side of things. So the easiest decision for a bank to make is no. So you want to be able to put your case forward and show them the reasons why they should trust you with their money.
Is there such a thing as the best bank for young people or people buying their first home?
As I mentioned, fundamentally at their core, all banks are very, very similar in what they do. But, their policy niches and the way they approach things are all vastly different. And so when you mentioned before about the bank statements and those sorts of things, you see some lenders are far more forensic with their assessment of bank statements than others. And so that means that could be a great bank, but if you've got some issues in your spending history or something like that, then they won't be the best bank for you, but they may have been the best bank for me. The best bank for your parents invariably probably isn't the best bank for you when you're buying your first house. in that situation. The best bank for you to have for your farming business is not necessarily going to be the best bank for you when you buy that investment property in town. It might be, but sometimes it's not. And so we often see our clients with their core businesses at one bank, and then they've got an investment property or a holiday house, and that'll be at a different bank. And then you'll see their equipment's at a number of other different banks based on, different reasons. So there is no best bank. And it can change. The best bank this week might not be the best bank next week. So it's just about finding what is the best possible outcome for you at that time and then reviewing it and looking at it. And we do that proactively on an annual basis as a minimum, but just checking in and saying, is this still the best outcome? Is there a better option? And I think that's one of the critical differences between banks and brokers. It's very unlikely that your bank manager is going to ring you up and say, hey, I think it might be better if you change banks. I don't think too many bank managers will be doing that. So
I'm guessing you never did that back in the day, did you?
No, never. Not wow. Okay. Sometimes there's clients that you might want them to change banks, so you can sometimes suggest there could be an option, mate. But invariably, you want to hang on to your clients, and so you're not very often ringing them up and saying, "Hey, this is the best bank for you. You should move down the road." That doesn't happen, but yeah, it does change.
Because that's an interesting concept with the whole broker is I'm guessing it's legally, but also your obligation is to your client to get them the best deal. Whereas with the bank is to get the best deal, like the bank manager or the bank doesn't make them bad in any way, shape or form. It's just their job is to get the deal across the line and get that client within the bank. So the idea of a broker is you can go and have those conversations and hopefully they can then, finding the right one, because there's good and bad in every industry, but is trying to find that right fit for you that gives you all the things that you need with the least amount of things you don't want.
100%. I think it's important to note that in a residential setting, so whether it's a home loan or a investment property loan, brokers are bound by what's called the best interest duty, and that is required by law that we have to do what's in the best interests of the borrower. And banks, by their very nature, can't comply with best interest duty because the bank is not going to recommend a different bank if they know that it's a better thing. So they can't comply with that. So they're not bound by it, obviously.
So just to start to wrap this up, Ryan, if you've got a young person or a mum and dad that have got, some early 20s next generation, and they go, you know what, investment property might be what we want to do, or we maybe want to buy our first home to live in, because for a lot of people, they want to move into their first home. What's the first step? Like if you said, righto, this week you need to take one action, what do they need to go and do?
The first step they should do is get on the internet and ring and find a mortgage broker and have a chat to them about gathering some information and doing an assessment on what their borrowing capacity looks like and where do they sit. How much money can they borrow based on what their income is? And then understanding if they do or don't have a deposit that's sufficient to support what their income will allow them to borrow. And if that requires some time to build up a deposit, then set a strategy in place, whether that be a savings plan or some sort of investment plan like you mentioned, or just set a plan in place so that you can start to prepare. But the first thing to understand is what does your income allow you to borrow in the marketplace? And then you can set a strategy from there. And once you understand that, then you can start talking to real estate agents or buyer's agents and working out what options are in your price range, in which locations. So that's the one thing that I would do, is just have a chat to a broker and understand what your borrowing capacity looks like. And obviously, it's you could have a chat to the family bank as well if you like and see what their thoughts are. It's always nice to involve the banker and the family bank to understand if it's part of the broader strategy as well. So make sure that there's not going to be any complications with anything that you might be doing outside, depending on how entangled you are in the family business. That's an important one, because going off and buying an off-farm asset or an investment property somewhere or a house to live in town is obviously a great idea, but if there are complications with the broader family banking arrangement, you want to make sure that you understand that as well before you just go and buy what is an isolated asset, because the bank may not view it in that same manner.
Yep. No, I appreciate that, because it can obviously the generosity of spirit of parents providing guarantees or deposits, etc., to be able to help them out. And if it then impinges on the business's ability to borrow or pivot, that can be quite a problem for families, especially if you've got, say, 3 or 4 kids and you, in this case, you help them out with a deposit each or a guarantee each. That actually can add up pretty quick if it's $50,000 to $100,000 $4 for kids. It could be from anywhere from $200 to $500,000. All of a sudden, that comes off your ability to borrow on the farm. So you just need to make sure you get that good advice. And the second thing I'd get them to do, mate, is once they've done that, is then have a chat with the family accountant and sit down with the family accountant and say, as a family, and say, look, this is what we're trying to do. Can you give us some advice on how we should structure this? I think would be a good second step for them, because the family accountant, if they're a good one, should know the family situation intimately. And if they want to add value to the family, they'll be more than happy to sit down and talk you through, from their point of view, the legal and tax structuring issues.
Yeah. And I think finally also understanding that if buying a property is not on the, the near-term horizon, then understanding what other things can we do to, help build some appreciating wealth. Obviously, we know sitting cash in the bank is, the value of that cash is going backwards through inflation. So important to point out, I'm not a financial planner, but it's always handy to go and have a chat to a planner maybe and consider what other appreciating sort of investments you might be able to make whilst you're preparing and building up for your deposit. Obviously, you can't buy, the front half of a house if you can't afford the whole one, but you might be able to buy a little bit of, some shares or some sort of managed fund or something like that to help, so that you're not just parking your money in cash. And that can be a challenge sometimes, because if you're not saving quickly enough and the property market is growing at a decent rate, you may be saving, $1,000 a month. But if the value of the property you're trying to buy is going up by $1,500 a month in the equivalent, you're not actually getting anywhere. And so looking at maybe some other types of investments that can help, but obviously with the full knowledge and support of someone who's qualified to give that advice, Ben, which I'm clearly not.
And I think that's just a really important point to wrap this up. Is I did the disclaimer for the lawyers in the beginning, but I like to do it again because the industry is really rife with this. Get advice, everyone. Get advice from a broker or your banker or a financial advisor or a lawyer or an accountant. Figure out what you need. Get all the advice you need, because the landmines you can tread on are fairly significant, and it's quite often cheaper to get that advice up front than try to fix it later on. So now, Ryan, as we start to wind this up, I've got a couple of quick more questions, but for you, is there anything else you want to sort of add in before we start to wind this up, mate? Some last little bit of advice?
Mate, I don't think so. Just preparation. There's an old saying, I won't repeat the whole thing, but preparation does prevent poor performance. So make sure you're prepared and understand what's happening. And where possible, try and be armed with some knowledge so that you can, build some deeper questions, but at the same time be open to the feedback and the advice that comes back from you. Sometimes people will, do a lot of Googling and be very knowledgeable in the field, and then they'll make some assumptions or some self-assessments around where they're at or where they're not at, and they can be a bit off the mark sometimes. And so, understanding, even sometimes you talk to, just like I don't have an in-depth understanding of Australian taxation law, but I do have some knowledge. Your accountant has a lot of knowledge around lending, but they don't have an in-depth understanding of some of the policies in the particular niches. And so just make sure you're getting the right advice from the right expert in that field, but at the same time getting that breadth of advice, I suppose. So, yeah. And don't take advice from, the mate at the footy club or the netball club or what have you. They certainly can spark some ideas, but just because they did it 6 months ago doesn't mean it's going to be the same way that you're going to be able to do it. So.
Yeah, get your advice from the right place. Awesome. RB Finance, tell us a bit about the business, Ryan.
RB Finance, so yeah, as you mentioned at the start, we're based in Toowoomba in southeast Queensland. We service, most of our clients are in that central, southern Queensland, northern New South Wales, but we do have clients all around Australia. You can find out a bit more about us. Obviously, Google RB Finance and we'll pop up. We're a small team. There's family-owned business. There's 6 of us, I think, 5 of us at the minute. So, yeah, we do our lending that we're offering is right from the large-scale, agribusiness kind of farming families down to, mum and dad investors and first home buyers. So we do service the whole market, but typically most of our clients are with a rural background, typically mostly self-employed. And with my background all being in ag banking, that's part of what we really enjoy, is helping farming families, showing them what's possible and setting the path to achieve it.
Awesome, mate. Right, one final question I like to ask everyone. Now, I usually say if you could go back to in your mid-20s, I'll just say 20 years ago, when I first met you, what's one piece of advice, if you could go back to then and sit down and have a beer or a coffee with young Ryan, what's one piece of advice you'd give yourself?
That time moves very quickly and you don't have as much time as you think. And so if I had have truly understood the impact of inflation and the capital growth that occurs through property and through the equity market, I would have done a lot more investing a lot earlier and would have a greater wealth position than I do now. So I did buy my first house when I was 20. I sold it when I was 26, and I probably should never have sold that house. I should have hung on to it. And so I think, just you've got a lot of time, but at the same time it goes very quickly, and time is the thing that builds wealth. And so the earlier you start, the more you're going to have at the end.
Yeah, a bit more building wealth and a little bit less taking out that money out of ATM machines in the pub late on a Friday night, hey?
Yeah, that's the thing, mate. It was I wasn't the ideal borrowing candidate back in the day, mate. So, perhaps a little bit – I'm not going to say have less fun, because I certainly enjoyed my 20s, the bits I can remember. But, it's met one of your good friends, obviously, in my mid-20s, which got me on the right path, and she's still here today, keeping me on the right track. So, that's another good bit of advice, mate. Make sure you find the right partner in crime.
Yeah. That's choice of spouse or make or break you is my catch cry to my nieces and nephews. And every time I see them, I say, what's Uncle Benny's number one piece of advice? And they roll their eyes and go, choice of spouse or make or break you, Uncle Benny, every single time that I hammer it into them, because your choice of occupation or pursuit plus your choice of partner in life will be your greatest determiner of your happiness. So, choose wisely. But I love your bit of advice, mate. Start early. Compounding interest happens over time, and before you know it, you'll click your fingers and time's disappeared. So great bit of advice. Well, look, Ryan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. RB Finance, Google, you'll be able to find it if you can't reach out to me. Thanks very much for today. And, mate, look forward to having you on again when we've got a specific topic we want to dig into.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Appreciate the opportunity to have a chat. And, if anyone needs a hand, just sing out.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So just before we wind this up, I just want to give you one thing to take away. There's some absolutely cracking bank managers out there that do an amazing job. There's also some terrible ones. There's some absolutely cracking brokers out there. There's also some terrible ones. There's some cracking financial advisors, accountants, lawyers, but there's also some really bad ones. Make sure you do your research and find the right people. I can't stress that enough, because the difference between a cracking professional and a pretty ordinary one doesn't appear like much when you first talk to them, but the results long-term can be significant. Now, if you're serious about raising the next generation to be financially independent themselves, and you're wanting to give them the skills to grow and manage wealth, these are the conversations that you need to be having with them, because these are the conversations that matter. Taking action early is what Ryan said, and that can really change the trajectory of their future and also your family's future. And, the insights that Ryan gave us today give you a bit of a roadmap to be able to get started right away. And if this episode sparks something in you, share it with another young person out there or a family that might benefit from hearing it. Until next time, I'm Ben Law, I'm the Financial Bloke, and remember, it's more important who you are than what you've got. I'll see you next time. You've built a serious business, scaled, profitable, and something to be proud of. But here's the question. What happens next? If your kids are now in their 20s and you're 5 to 10 years from stepping back, this is the moment to get everyone on the same page before decisions get forced on you. That's exactly what will help you do at the High Performing Families Roadmap Workshop, back this October by demand. In 2 days off farm, you'll create a clear 10-year family roadmap, align on where you're headed, and get the next generation genuinely engaged in the future. But here's the thing to note. If you're considering coming to the workshop, we only have 3 seats left in our High Performing Families Mastermind group. And when those seats are full, I'm not going to have capacity to run any more workshops. So this is most likely the last roadmap workshop for quite a while. Want to know more? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/take action and grab your seat. Now, let's get back to the episode.